Okay, hello everyone. My name is Courtney Sand, and I'm a licensed and board certified behavior analyst and a certified brain injury specialist trainer. I am currently employed as a neuro resource facilitator with the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa in the United States. One of the topics that I am very passionate about, learning about, teaching about, and infusing into my work at the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa is ambiguous loss. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, both professionally as well as personally. The overarching goal of my presentation today is to, one, raise awareness of and normalize ambiguous loss, and two, to communicate that there is hope in effectively navigating ambiguous loss and living well while you do so. Today may be the first time you've heard of ambiguous loss. Caregivers and care partners navigate these painful, confusing feelings every day, but often do not know that their journey has a name: ambiguous loss. The development of this presentation is from the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa and funded through the Brain Injury Services Program of Iowa through a contract with the Iowa Department of Public Health. The content of this presentation is not intended to be a substitute for professional or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical situation. And never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard in this presentation. As a result of attending this webinar, attendees will be able to describe ambiguous loss and why it's unique, explain how ambiguous loss affects caregivers, discuss the 6 guidelines of living with ambiguous loss and how to apply them. Caregivers and care partners, my hope is that you will walk away from this presentation today with validation that your experience in fact has a name, with the tools to navigate it successfully. Professionals, my hope is that you will come away from this presentation understanding how ambiguous loss touches the lives of the people that you serve, increasing your competence and confidence in supporting them in navigating ambiguous loss. Our society's response to grief is an incomplete list. Our society accepts the need to grieve and publicly mourn a physical death. Our society has little understanding of the need to and the process of grieving someone who is still alive, yet changed, present yet not. Your loved one that you knew in the before, that version of them is gone. It feels very much like a death, but you're grieving someone who is still alive. When living with ambiguous loss, in the work that I do in the field of brain injury specifically, caregivers often hear things like, "You should count your blessings. At least he's still alive. You should be grateful. At least she can still walk, talk. You should be thankful. At least he can still work." No one wants to live an at least life. When people at least all over you, you make them feel minimized, defeated, alone, silenced, shut down, unheard, compared, invalidated. Because they're still here, yet not. And you think to yourself, I don't feel lucky. This is not luck. I don't feel blessed. And these are very raw, very real, very common ways to think and feel when living with and trying to navigate ambiguous loss. Because brain injury, along with many, many other life-changing diagnoses, are often hidden, the impacts are often not visible to others. When those around you don't recognize and acknowledge your deep, deep grief and make you feel that you don't have permission to grieve this kind of unique, crushing loss, you are left feeling incredibly lonely, isolated. And it's not uncommon at all for caregivers to purposely self-isolate to avoid comments and questions from people who don't understand what they're going through. Our society assigns a timeline to grief, an unfair and unrealistic timeline. With grief, there is no timeline, no endpoint. Grief is not something you get to, rather it's a process you continually move through. It's not predictable, it's not linear, and you don't move expectedly from one stage to the next. Grief is messy. And grief that lasts longer than weeks or months often looks self-indulgent, attention-seeking, dramatic, a pity party to the world around you. You are not required to be over your grief at any point ever. Our society operates by a set of unspoken and sometimes blatantly spoken shoulds for how we ought to feel and behave in the face of sorrow. Each person's grief is like a fingerprint, individual and unique. Grief is a deeply personal experience. The first step, where do we go from here? Name it and acknowledge it so you can get clear about what you need to cope with it and heal it. Ambiguous loss. So let's define it. Ambiguous loss is the loss a person experiences when there is a lack of resolution or clarity, no verification or death, or no certainty that the person will come back or return to the way they used to be. Pauline Boss, a pioneer in this field, first coined the term while studying families of soldiers who went missing in action in the 1970s. Ambiguous loss is a relational condition because it ruptures relationships. It's a coming undone from previous attachments, an unraveling. It's not a grief disorder, rather it's a situational one. And there are two types of ambiguous loss. Type 1 is marked by physical absence with a psychological presence. So in sum, the person is physically absent from your life, but very much alive in your heart and mind. Some examples of type 1 include someone that's gone missing, abduction, divorce, adoption, military deployment, immigration, slavery, genocide, natural disasters, miscarriage, stillbirth, abortion, early childhood death, incarceration, institutional placement, gender transitioning, and singleness. Singleness because there is a missing person, a desired partner or spouse present in your mind, yet physically absent from your life. Type 2 of ambiguous loss. This is the type that is specific to the work that I do in the field of brain injury, and the type that I will be talking about specifically today. This type is marked by physical presence with emotional, psychological, or cognitive absence. So in sum, the person is physically present in your life, but changed emotionally, psychologically, and or cognitively. They don't act the same, think the same, interact the same, or function quote unquote typically or normally. Some examples of type 2 include addiction, Alzheimer's, ALS, Parkinson's, dementia, brain injury, disorders of consciousness, chronic mental illness, autism spectrum disorder, workaholism, affairs, and obsession with electronics. You're grieving someone who is still alive, yet changed, present, yet not. Someone who is still alive right in front of you, but it's not the person that you recognize, that you know, like, respect, or have patience or compassion for. There is an emotional death before a physical one. Ambiguous loss feels like you lose your loved one over and over and over again, yet they're right in front of you. And you're reminded over and over and over again of how you and your life are different now. You're living this new nightmare, this paralyzing truth day after day after day. You've lost something precious, someone precious, but no one has actually died. There is no body to bury, no death certificate, no certainty. This makes it very, very challenging to cope. Complicated loss means complicated grief. Ambiguous loss is actually considered to be one of the most stressful kinds of griefs that there are because the loss is unpredictable and unending. Ambiguous loss is having but not having. It's also referred to as extraordinary grief, frozen sadness, mobile mourning, chronic sorrow, incremental death, unending loss, the longest loss, and the long goodbye. This grief is ongoing because the loss is ongoing. It's grief that reaches into the past to what was and how things were, as well as into the future to what could have been, the milestones, what you imagined for your life. For the parent of a child with a brain injury, for example, future dreams, participation in sports and school activities, going to college, getting a job, getting married, grandchildren. For the wife of a husband with a brain injury, the dream house, the trip you plan to take, hobbies you look forward to, retirement, growing old together, grandparenting together. Ambiguous loss is absolutely devastating, and it leaves you feeling hopeless, unable, and not wanting to inhabit this new life in the after. If I can't be who I was, I don't want to be here. You are relearning the world in the aftermath of deep loss. The effects of ambiguous loss are crushing. It immobilizes individuals and their relationships, confuses the decision-making process, freezes the grief process, blocks coping processes, prevents closure, and leads to feelings of helplessness, hopelessness, and exhaustion. Individual effects of ongoing ambiguous loss include things like anxiety and depression, hopelessness, helplessness, identity confusion, anxious attachments with others, substance use, violence, and suicide. Ambiguity, the not knowing anything for certain, living in a world of blinding shades of gray, is the culprit. It's an irrational loss, so people respond irrationally. And it's not a sign of pathology, a diagnosis, a character flaw, or a personal weakness. There is nothing wrong with you. It's the situation. It's ambiguous loss. There's a name for how you feel. And it's important to remember that your reaction to the situation is not crazy. The situation is, and it can make you feel crazy and have big, ugly feelings, and it's not your fault and it's expected. Pauline Boss says you've lost trust in the world as a fair and a rational place. It's all about relationships. So we are, to a large extent, defined by the relationships we have with others. We are a certain way with them, and they are a certain way with us. We are a certain way together. With ambiguous loss, you grieve who they were as well as who you were in relation to them. Author Megan O'Rourke, in her book, The Long Goodbye, says when you lose someone you were close to, you have to reassess your picture of the world and your place in it. Ambiguous loss is a relational condition. Thus, it requires relational interventions like family and community-based interventions, or the concept of community care. And we'll discuss this concept a bit more later. With respect to brain injury, the field that I work in, we tend to group its primary impact into three domains: physical, cognitive, and emotional behavioral. Mobility issues, communication challenges, changes in vision and hearing, increased fatigue, decreased frustration tolerance, the need for more processing time. These are usually visible, overt impacts. And the effect of primary impacts on someone's life are generally obvious to others. These impacts generally garner much more compassion than secondary impacts do. With respect to ambiguous loss, a secondary impact can be a loss of relationship mutuality, the loss of a partnership. The balance has shifted. Things are and feel very one-sided now. You are no longer able to participate in previous familiar roles and duties. Things like being a two-income family, co-parenting together as a unit, being lovers, being best friends and each other's confidant. You had to quit a job that you absolutely love and gave you purpose and identity to become a full-time caregiver. You're essentially parenting alone. You have no free time, no me time, and you feel resentful, jealous, angry, sad. Another secondary impact is self-identity. This can feel like an out-of-body experience where you are just going through the motions, barely functioning, just trying to get from 1 minute to the next. Your mind has to catch up with this new reality, and it's a process. I don't recognize myself. I miss who I used to be. Who am I now? I used to have a partner. I used to be part of a team. I used to be just his wife. Our children used to have two parents. I used to have help around the house. I used to have a life. I used to have faith in God, and the list goes on and on. Uncertainty. Another secondary impact is uncertainty. If and how much will he or she return to his or her former self? There are no guarantees or timeframes. As a result, you fluctuate between hope and hopelessness. And then to add to that confusion, sometimes the old he or she reappears. This leaves you feeling frozen with uncertainty. And living this way leaves you feeling confused, distracted, hypervigilant, always on edge, anxious, paralyzed, and it prevents you from being fully present in your life. Having mixed conflicting emotions is another secondary impact. Caregivers experience a range of mixed conflicting emotions about this new person in their life. Feelings like confusion, gratitude, jealousy, bitterness, resentment, betrayal, anger, guilt, hope, hopelessness. Confusion because you grieve your life and what it looked like in the before, but you're also thankful that he or she survived. These polar opposite conflicting feelings are very confusing and terribly guilt-inducing, but they are expected and okay to have. With ambiguous loss, your destiny, the future, seems incredibly clouded. You're unable to see past the next few minutes, hours, and days. It feels like you're fumbling your way through a thick, dark, unending fog. Pauline Boss developed 6 guidelines for living well with ambiguous loss. 6 goals for treatment intervention. These are not meant to be gone through in a linear fashion, nor is the goal closure or certainty. As like I've said throughout my presentation, ambiguous loss is not linear or predictable, and closure is not a thing. The goal of these guidelines, according to Pauline, is not to regain your independence, but rather to stay resilient and healthy in a relationship that is now less than perfect with a loved one who's physically present but psychologically absent. So in other words, the primary focus is not on how independent you are or are not, rather a goal of taking good care of yourself mentally and physically while stepping into this new role as a caregiver with someone who is physically here, yet not. Rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion. The first guideline for living well with ambiguous loss is finding meaning. Finding meaning refers to making sense out of the situation. This step is about finding sense in a senseless situation. You are not crazy. The situation is. So what helps? Giving the problem a name, ambiguous loss. Once the phenomenon has a name, you can begin the process of navigating it. Realizing that this journey you've been on has a name is tremendously validating. Just like finally receiving a diagnosis of some kind, an answer you've been searching and waiting for, it doesn't make things easier to deal with per se, but at least you know what you're dealing with. You realize that it's not an experience unique to only you. You aren't alone. I've had many, many clients weep upon hearing that their experience has a name. It's an incredibly powerful, moving moment. What else helps find meaning? Talk with others. Support groups can be so validating, so healing in this way. Forgive yourself for others. Continuing but adapting family rituals and celebrations. Rituals matter because they can help you find meaning in loss. Another very powerful thing that helps with finding meaning is using both and thinking. Both and thinking. Absence and presence are not absolutes. This is a cornerstone in navigating ambiguous loss. It's learning to hold and live with opposing truths in one's mind at the same time in absence of answers, pairing them together. We can both hold on and let go. We can both be terrified and brave. We can both be thankful and grieve. Gratitude and grief don't cancel each other out. They can exist side by side. In other words, you can and should hold gratitude and hope in one hand and uncertainty and grief in the other. You can make space for both. Both and thinking provides the resiliency to move forward even when ambiguity persists. You may be telling yourself, I need to focus on the positive and not let the grief penetrate through. This is not possible or required of you. Strength emerges not from one absolute truth, but from holding on to an array of possibilities. For example, I am both grateful to be her husband and devastated that I am now his caretaker. I take care of both him and myself. I am both a caregiver and a person with my own needs. I am both sad about my lost hopes and dreams and happy about some new plans ahead. I am both thankful that he is still alive and sometimes wish that he hadn't. I must find a way to both hold on and let go. And I am both hurting and I am healing. Very powerful stuff. Finding meaning. So what hinders this step? Things like seeking revenge, retribution, family secrets, isolation, seeking closure. The second guideline for living well with ambiguous loss is adjusting mastery. Adjusting mastery refers to increasing one's ability to live with the ambiguity and decreasing one's need to fix or solve the problem. In my culture, Western culture, we are mastery oriented. We strive to control everything in our lives to the best of our ability. We are a can-do society focused on answers and solutions. But ambiguous loss takes us out of our hands completely. And the more mastery oriented we are, the harder time we have with a problem that has no, quote, solution. So what helps in adjusting mastery? Recognizing that the world is not always fair, decreasing self-blame, externalizing blame. The culprit, the thing to blame here is the ambiguity. Mastering one's internal self. While you cannot control the loss at hand, you can control your reaction to it by engaging in helpful, mindful practices to master your internal self, like meditation, exercise, yoga, prayer, deep breathing and guided relaxation. Adjusting mastery. What hinders this step? Things like believing that you have somehow failed if you are not over it. You will never and do not have to get over it. It's okay if you thought you were better, that you were fine, only to be hit unexpectedly with a giant wave of grief. It's okay if you thought you had everything under control, just to realize that you don't. You're not required to feel strong all of the time. And these are not setbacks. Rather, they're an expected part of the experience of ambiguous loss. And another truth is that it's okay to talk about this grief, how you're feeling, what you're experiencing, the death of you and your loved one in the before. That version of them and of you lived and mattered. You can honor that. I dug until I found me. The third guideline for living well with ambiguous loss is reconstructing identity. Reconstructing identity refers to seeing oneself in a new way now that someone is missing. Following a massive and confusing loss, like brain injury, for example, identities are shaken. What helps in reconstructing identity? Finding a psychological family, be it blood-related family members, friends, colleagues. Grief and mourning does not need to be and shouldn't be something that we experience and do in the privacy of our inner lives all alone. Society often tells us that it's not appropriate to be vulnerable in front of other people, so we hold each other at a distance. Grief deserves to be witnessed, to be truly seen and heard, normalized, validated, and empathized with. I mentioned the concept of community care earlier on in my presentation. Community care addresses the fact that humans are naturally cooperative. People need people. We need each other. We need each other to psychologically persevere and be resilient. Reconstructing identity, what hinders? Not wanting to change who you are and not wanting to change what you do. I hate the new me. I don't want to live like this. I don't want to learn how. Reconstructing identity is easier said than done. It's an ongoing process. Your grief does not have to master your identity, does not have to be first in line when you introduce yourself. You are more than how you and your life have been changed. You are more than your grief. The fourth guideline for living well with ambiguous loss is normalizing ambivalence. Normalizing ambivalence refers to tolerating the tension of mixed, conflicting emotions. What helps? Normalizing anger and guilt, but not harmful actions that hurt yourself or others. Seeing conflicting feelings is normal. I am both thankful that he survived and sometimes wish that he hadn't. Talking about your feelings with a professional or peer group. Connect with people who understand your experience and can help you navigate it. Recognize it is both normal and human to feel those feelings, and they're not right or wrong, they just are. Once you talk about them, they become less powerful. If you're not talking about them, you're storing them, and that gets really, really heavy and hard to carry all alone. Normalizing ambivalence, what hinders this step? Denying or keeping secret that you sometimes wish it were over. And it's okay to hate the way your life looks now. It's not okay. It's not what you wanted. And it's not what you imagined for yourself. It's okay to have and hold these very strong, very weighty, very human feelings and thoughts about your grief. The fifth guideline for living well with ambiguous loss is revising attachment. This refers to letting go while also holding on to someone. What helps? Recognizing that you and your loved one are both here and gone. It is possible to deeply grieve the past and what you've lost and simultaneously celebrate and treasure what you still have. It is possible to let go of the past while still treasuring it. You can miss what was lost while also being grateful for what you still have. Again, it doesn't have to be one or the other. And what else helps? Finding new human connections, sharing and connecting with others, not expecting closure, because remember, there's no such thing. Revising attachment, what hinders this step? Namely, holding on without also developing new attachments with others. Some of the most complicated grief we'll ever do is mourning the life we should have had. The sixth and final guideline for living well with ambiguous loss is discovering new hope. Discovering new hope refers to imagining a new way of being with or without the quote missing person. What helps? Becoming more comfortable with ambiguity, with not having the answers, laughing at absurdity, Redefining justice. Things like bad things happen to good people, and the world is not always just. Also, imagining new options. Give yourself permission to hope. New hope for the future can exist alongside old hope. And don't give up on this new version of you. This new you deserves a chance. Give yourself permission to hope. Get to know what you need, how you're different now. You're shifting. And lastly, another thing that helps with discovering new hope is feeling some control, even if the ambiguity persists and things don't go your way. Control what you can. And discovering new hope, what hinders? Isolation, insisting on always having the answer, and seeking closure instead of meaning. In the face of ambiguous loss, there is hope. You can navigate it, and you can learn how to live well while managing it. I always like to close my presentations on ambiguous loss with this poem because it's so lovely and it so beautifully and accurately weaves itself through the process of navigating this kind of grief. I had my own notion of grief. I thought it was the sad time that followed the death of someone you love, and you had to push through it to get to the other side. But I am learning that there is no other side. There is no pushing through, but rather there is absorption, adjustment, acceptance. And grief is not something you complete, but rather you endure. Grief is not a task to finish and move on, but an element of yourself, an alteration of your being, a new way of seeing, a new definition of self. These are the resources I used to put this presentation together. For the most part, you'll see Pauline Boss. This is the researcher that coined the phrase ambiguous loss. So those are those resources that I used. I highly recommend. And I just want to say thank you. What an honor it is to have been invited on the global stage to speak about something that is so important to me, both personally and professionally. And as I mentioned earlier on, I hope that at the very least, you've walked away with an awareness of what ambiguous loss is. And more than that, whether you are a caregiver, a person served, a professional, that you have an idea now of the tangible tools that you can use to not only live with ambiguous loss, but to navigate it effectively and live well while doing so. Thank you very much.